The afternoon sun baked the pavement of Oak Ridge, a suburb that prided itself on manicured lawns and quiet streets. This was the kind of neighborhood where people nodded to each other at mailboxes, where children rode bicycles without fear, where the most dramatic event of the week was usually a homeowners association meeting about fence heights. The community had built a reputation around safety, around order, around the unspoken agreement that nothing serious ever happened here. Marcus Coleman knew better than to believe that. He had spent 20 years in the Federal Bureau of Investigation, 20 years tracking organized crime syndicates, dismantling human trafficking networks, pursuing international terrorists through the darkest corners of the world. He had learned that peace was always fragile, that violence rarely announced itself with fanfare, that trouble usually arrived dressed as something mundane. At 58 years old, Marcus had traded the adrenaline-soaked concrete canyons of Washington, D.C. for the slow, predictable rhythm of Oak Ridge. A decade ago, a spinal injury had forced his early retirement from the Bureau. The doctors had been clear. His legs would not recover. The wheelchair was not temporary. The disability was permanent. He had accepted this with the same discipline he had brought to his federal work. He had moved to Oak Ridge because it was quiet, because the pace felt right for the next phase of his life, because he wanted to disappear into ordinariness for a while. The constant vigilance of his career had worn on him in ways he had not fully understood until the injury gave him permission to stop. Now, as his motorized wheelchair hummed quietly along the sidewalk of Elm Street, Marcus carried himself with the same bearing he always did. Even seated, his posture was immaculately straight. His shoulders were still broad, still carrying the weight of decades of responsibility. His silver-peppered hair and neat beard framed a face lined by age, lined by the heavy burdens of a life spent peering into human darkness. His dark eyes missed nothing. Even in retirement, they constantly scanned his environment, a habit he could not break, the ghost of an operational mindset that refused to entirely fade. The wheelchair hummed as he navigated the afternoon sidewalk. The gentle breeze was pleasant. The sky was clear. Everything about this Tuesday felt ordinary and safe, which was precisely why Marcus remained alert. He had learned long ago that the worst days always started as the best days. His mission today was simple. He needed to stop at the corner grocer to pick up fresh basil and a newspaper. He held a small, reusable canvas bag on his lap, the kind of small domestic detail that would have seemed impossible to his younger self. A federal agent worried about grocery shopping, about basil, about the simple pleasure of a quiet afternoon. But that was the point. He had earned this ordinariness. He had paid the price for 20 years of urgency. Now he was allowed to move slowly through a small suburb and notice the afternoon breeze. As he approached the intersection of 4th Avenue, the pedestrian crossing light glowed a steady white silhouette. Marcus checked both ways. A lifelong habit. He engaged the joystick on his right armrest. The wheelchair rolled smoothly off the curb ramp and onto the asphalt. He was halfway across the street when the small jar of expensive artisanal honey he had bought as a treat slipped from his lap. The jar shattered on the pavement with a sound that was somehow both delicate and final. Golden syrup spread across the white lines of the crosswalk, glinting in the afternoon sun. Marcus sighed, a sound of mild annoyance. Nothing more. He stopped the chair in the middle of the road, putting it in park, and carefully leaned forward to assess the mess. He could not easily bend down to clean it with his wheelchair, but he did not want a car to puncture a tire on the thick glass shards that glittered on the asphalt. He reached into his side pouch to grab a small rag, intending to push the larger pieces toward the gutter. At that exact moment, the roaring engine of a police cruiser turned onto 4th Avenue. Officer Derek Hayes sat in his patrol car idling near the off-ramp of Interstate 40. He was 24 years old. He had been off probation for exactly 6 weeks. To Derek, those 6 weeks felt like a resurrection. The initial training period, the evaluation, the constant scrutiny. All of it was finally behind him. Now he had the keys to a patrol cruiser. Now he had the badge. Now he had authority. And authority was all he had ever really wanted. Derek wore his uniform like a superhero cape, not because he understood what a police officer was supposed to be, but because the uniform gave him something he had never had before: power. In high school, he had been overlooked. In his family, he had been the disappointment. At the academy, he had barely scraped through. But in this cruiser, with this badge, with this gun on his hip, Derek Hayes was someone. Derek Hayes mattered. Derek Hayes could make people do things. His fingers drummed impatiently against the steering wheel. He wanted action. He wanted a story to tell at the end of his shift. Something that would prove to the other officers that he belonged here, that he deserved this badge. He had spent the afternoon cruising through Oak Ridge, looking for something. Anything that would justify his hunger. He wanted a major arrest. He wanted to be the department's rising star. He wanted everyone to know that Derek Hayes was destined for detective work, for promotions, for the kind of career that would make his family finally look at him with respect instead of embarrassment. What Derek did not understand was that authority granted without wisdom becomes tyranny. His instructors had noted it in their evaluations. Excessive force tendencies, pattern of escalation, questionable judgment with authority figures. They had recommended he not be released early from probation. But Oak Ridge Police Department had severe staffing shortages, and Derek's supervisor had decided that 6 weeks of probation was good enough. Sometimes paperwork mattered more than caution. Derek had interpreted these evaluations as jealousy. He thought his instructors were threatened by his aggressiveness. He believed they simply did not understand that sometimes you had to show people who was in charge. That was what his father had always said. Show them who holds the power and they will respect you. Derek's father had said many things, none of them kind. So Derek sat in his cruiser on this Tuesday afternoon, hungry for a moment where he could exercise the authority he had been given. He did not understand that authority was supposed to be a responsibility. To Derek, it was a weapon. When he saw the black Dodge Charger take the exit ramp from Interstate 40-something in him shifted. A late-model Charger, sleek and expensive, in a neighborhood where most people drove sensible sedans. A black man driving it. Derek's eyes narrowed. In Derek's mind, the pieces did not fit. In Derek's mind, something was wrong. He pulled out from his hiding spot and began following the Charger, accelerating until he was riding just 2 car lengths behind. Derek had no legal reason to stop this vehicle. No traffic violation had occurred. No crime had been reported. But Derek did not need a reason. Derek had already decided that something was wrong. Inside the Charger, Special Agent David Sterling had just wrapped up one of the longest days of his career. He was a 58-year-old federal agent with 22 years of service with the FBI. He was attached to the Regional Violent Gang Task Force, and today he had coordinated a multi-agency takedown of a narcotics ring. The operation had been complex, high stakes, and ultimately successful. 3 major traffickers were now in federal custody. Dozens of victims would be helped. The gang's supply chain had been disrupted, but the cost had been 18 hours of relentless focus, constant communication. The weight of knowing that if anything went wrong, if anyone was injured, the responsibility would land on his shoulders. David was exhausted in the way that only federal agents can be. A bone-deep tiredness that went beyond physical fatigue. His tie was loosened. His eyes were heavy. All he wanted was to get to his suburban home, kiss his wife goodnight, and collapse into sleep. David had learned long ago that the drive home was when he finally let his guard down. The operation was over. The case was closed. The danger had passed. For the next 30 minutes, he could simply exist as a man driving through suburban streets, instead of as a federal agent carrying the weight of criminal justice on his shoulders. He noticed the headlights in his rearview mirror immediately. Years of tactical driving and situational awareness were so deeply embedded in his consciousness that they operated automatically, even when he was exhausted. The patrol car was maintaining distance but maintaining contact. David checked his speedometer. He was doing 33 in a 35-mile-per-hour zone. He was perfectly centered in his lane. He was doing everything correctly. David knew why the patrol car was following him. He had been in law enforcement long enough to understand. A late-model black Charger. A black man driving it. It was midnight. He was in a wealthy suburb. Derek Hayes was looking for a reason to pull him over, and David understood that Derek would find one or create one. David maintained his speed, kept his hands at 10 and 2 on the steering wheel, and waited. He waited for the moment when Derek would decide the margin between 33 and 35 was enough, or when Derek would find some other pretext. David had been through this before. Not often. His federal credentials usually protected him, but enough times to know the routine. When the red and blue lights flared to life, casting violent, strobing reflections across the dark suburban street, David sighed. He muttered something under his breath. Not a curse, just an acknowledgement of the inconvenience. He calmly pulled his vehicle onto the paved shoulder, parking directly under a streetlight to ensure maximum visibility for both himself and the officer. He rolled down his window, turned off the engine, turned on the interior dome light, and placed both hands firmly on the steering wheel. This was textbook federal protocol. This was exactly what he was trained to do. Behind him, Officer Derek Hayes killed the siren but left the strobes blindingly bright. He keyed his radio and called it in. Dispatch Unit 4, Bravo. I'm conducting a traffic stop on Elm and 4th. Black Dodge Charger. Derek stepped out of his vehicle, subconsciously puffing out his chest. He unclipped the retention strap on his holster, a severe violation of protocol for a routine traffic stop without visible threat. But Derek did not see routine. Derek saw opportunity. The cruiser's dash cam mounted dead center on the windshield began recording his every move, capturing high-definition video and crisp audio of the encounter that was about to unfold. Derek swaggered up to the driver's side window with the gait of a man who believed that his badge gave him the right to treat everyone with contempt. He did not greet David. He did not introduce himself. He did not offer any courtesy or explanation. He simply barked commands as if David were a criminal suspect, rather than a driver who had committed no traffic violation. License, registration, and proof of insurance. David looked at the young officer. Derek could not have been older than 25. Something in his demeanor screamed instability. His jaw was clenched. His shoulders were rigid. His hand kept drifting down toward his holster, an unconscious gesture of threat. David kept his hand securely planted on the top of the steering wheel. "Good evening, officer. I just want to inform you that I am carrying a concealed firearm on my right hip and my identification is in my left breast pocket. How would you like me to proceed?" It was the perfect, legally precise way to declare a weapon. It was exactly what a federal agent was trained to do. It was the responsible thing to do when interacting with law enforcement while carrying. But Derek, fueled by adrenaline and unchecked bias, did not hear a fellow law enforcement professional following protocol. He heard a threat. "Keep your hands on the wheel," Derek yelled, his voice cracking slightly as he took a half step back, his hand instantly dropping to grip the handle of his sidearm. David's voice remained calm and steady. "My hands are on the wheel, officer. I am not moving. I am simply informing you." "I said shut up," Derek interrupted, his flashlight trembling slightly as he shined it directly into David's eyes. "Why are you out here this late? Where are you coming from?" David squinted against the harsh beam. Everything in his body told him that this officer was dangerously unstable. But David had been in dangerous situations before. He knew how to de-escalate. He knew how to be reasonable when faced with unreasonableness. "I am coming home from work," David said, his voice careful and calm. "I live about 2 miles from here. Officer, if you will allow me to reach into my left pocket, you will see my credentials. I am a federal agent." Derek let out a sharp, mocking laugh. "Yeah, right. A federal agent and I am the president. Step out of the vehicle now." "Officer, I highly recommend you call your supervisor." David said, his patience beginning to thin, though his posture remained completely non-threatening. "You are making a significant mistake. Look at my license plate. It is federally registered. I am giving you a lawful order." But Derek was no longer listening to words. Derek was operating on instinct, on adrenaline, on the intoxicating rush of power that came from holding a badge and a gun. "Step out of the car," Derek screamed. "Keep your hands where I can see them, or I will extract you." Knowing the danger of arguing with a panicked, inexperienced cop holding a gun, David slowly unbuckled his seatbelt with his left hand, while keeping his right hand clearly visible on the wheel. "I am stepping out," David announced clearly, speaking loudly enough for the dash cam's microphone to pick up his words. "I am unarmed and my hands moving slowly." David pushed the door open and stepped out into the cold November air. He was a tall man, broad-shouldered. His presence was imposing simply because of his physical stature, but he moved carefully, deliberately, making sure every motion was visible and non-threatening. He wore a rumpled dress shirt and slacks, looking exactly like the exhausted federal agent he was. "Turn around, face the car. Put your hands behind your back," Derek ordered, his voice shaking now with adrenaline and something darker. The fear of a man who had decided he was in danger, and was now committed to acting as if he was. "Officer, my ID is right here." David tried one last time, nodding down toward his chest pocket. "Just look at the wallet." But Derek was past listening. Derek had crossed a line that he could not uncross. Derek had decided that David was a threat, and now he needed to prove that his fear was justified. Derek shoved David roughly against the side of the Charger. The impact dented the sleek side panel of the car, a sound of metal on metal that echoed in the quiet suburban street. Derek grabbed David's left arm and violently twisted it behind his back, clamping the cold steel of handcuffs tightly around his wrist. The metal bit into David's skin, tight enough to cause pain. "Stop resisting," Derek shouted, a phrase he had learned to yell to justify physical force, even though the dash cam clearly showed David standing completely still, offering zero physical opposition. "I am not resisting," David stated loudly, ensuring the cruiser's audio picked up his exact words. "You are acting recklessly. You are detaining an on-duty federal officer. Check my pocket." Derek locked the second cuff onto David's right wrist, ratcheting them down so hard the metal bit instantly into David's skin, drawing a thin line of blood. With the cuff secure, Derek began an aggressive pat-down, his hands rough and intrusive. When his hand brushed against the Glock 19 holstered on David's hip, Derek gasped loudly. "He has got a gun. Suspect is armed," Derek yelled, practically tripping backward as he unholstered his own weapon again, aiming it squarely at David's back. "Do not move. Do not breathe," Derek commanded, his voice pitched high with panic. "You already knew I had a weapon," David said, his voice finally carrying a sharp edge of authoritative anger. "I told you exactly where it was before I stepped out of the vehicle. It is my service weapon. I am Special Agent David Sterling with the FBI. My badge is in my front left pocket. If you shoot me, you will be spending the rest of your life in federal prison. Think very carefully about your next move." The utter lack of fear in David's voice seemed to penetrate Derek's panic, at least partially. Derek's hands trembled as he held the weapon. He was breathing in short, sharp gasps. He was standing in the suburban darkness with a loaded gun pointed at a restrained man, and he was finally beginning to understand that he had made a terrible mistake. But Derek did not lower his weapon. Instead, he keyed his radio with his free hand. "Dispatch, I have a suspect in custody, armed with service weapon, federal credentials in his possession, requesting backup all units." The words had been transmitted across the entire police radio frequency. Derek had just announced to every officer on the force that he had apprehended someone claiming to be federal. He had just made it public, and he still did not lower his weapon. The next minutes unfolded in a haze of adrenaline and procedural chaos. 2 additional patrol cars arrived within 5 minutes. The officers who emerged from those cars were younger than Derek, less experienced, and equally confused by what they were seeing. A black man in handcuffs, a gun in Derek's hand, a badge that Derek was refusing to look at. "Get his credentials," one of the backup officers suggested, finally applying some measure of reason to the situation. Derek, his hands still shaking, reached into David's left breast pocket without removing the handcuffs or lowering his weapon. He pulled out a leather wallet and opened it. His face went pale. FBI Special Agent credentials, a real badge, a real name, David Sterling, all of it legitimate. The backup officers exchanged looks that clearly communicated what they were all thinking. They had made a terrible mistake. "Sir, I'm extremely sorry," one of them began. But Derek cut him off. "He resisted arrest," Derek said, the lie coming out of his mouth in a desperate attempt to salvage the situation. "He was armed and he resisted." David, his wrists bleeding from the handcuffs, said nothing. He simply looked at each officer with an expression of such profound disappointment that it seemed to cut deeper than anger ever could. One of the backup officers made the right call. He radioed dispatch and requested that the FBI be notified immediately. He requested that Derek's supervisor be called. He requested that the Oak Ridge Police Department command staff be awakened, because what had just happened on a quiet suburban street was about to become a very significant problem. David was transported to Oak Ridge Police Station still in handcuffs, still in the car. Derek drove behind him, having finally lowered his weapon, but not his certainty that he had done nothing wrong. The other officers said nothing to Derek. They did not speak to him because there was nothing to say. In those few minutes in that quiet suburb, Derek had crossed a line that no police officer should ever cross. At the station, Derek was placed in an interview room by his sergeant. The sergeant, a man named Gregory Miller, was in his 50s and had been on the force long enough to understand how bad this situation was. He took Derek's statement, listened as Derek explained his reasoning, felt his stomach drop as Derek described spotting the charger, following it without cause, and escalating the traffic stop because David had seemed uncooperative. Miller was professional. He did not yell at Derek. He did not express his anger. He simply took the statement. And then he did something that would have profound consequences. He checked the Dashcam footage. The video was crystal clear. It showed everything. Derek approaching without cause. David being calm and reasonable. Derek's escalation. David's perfect compliance. Derek drawing his weapon on a restrained man. Derek's panic. All of it, documented in perfect high-definition audio and video. Miller watched the footage once, then played it again, and then he did what any competent supervisor should do. He immediately called his captain, who immediately called the FBI field office. By the time the sun came up the next morning, everything had changed. Derek was released from custody at 6 a.m. with instructions not to come to work pending an investigation. His attorney, a union representative named Peter Gable, who specialized in defending police officers regardless of evidence, arrived at the station before Derek had finished processing his release. Gable was a man who had made his career out of protecting police officers from the consequences of their actions. He saw Derek Hayes as a client who needed saving, not a young officer who needed accountability. Within hours, Gable had crafted a narrative. Derek had followed proper procedure. Derek had been attempting to investigate a suspicious vehicle in a high-crime area. Derek had exercised reasonable caution when the suspect claimed to be federal. Derek had acted out of an abundance of caution when the suspect was armed. Derek had done nothing wrong. This narrative was not true. The evidence contradicted it. But Gable did not traffic in evidence. Gable trafficked in doubt, in the gray areas of police procedures, in the presumption that officers deserved the benefit of the doubt. The police department's response was more measured but equally problematic. The brass wanted to appear thorough but not hostile to Derek. They opened an internal investigation. They said they would review the Dashcam footage. They said they would determine what had happened. What they did not say was that they were deeply afraid. A federal agent had been unlawfully arrested. A federal agent had been assaulted. This had happened in Oak Ridge, in broad daylight, well in the evening, and it had been caught on camera. The potential liability was staggering, but they also understood something else. Protecting Derek might be possible if they moved fast enough, if they controlled the narrative early enough, if they could frame this as a misunderstanding rather than a crime. David was released without charges being filed. His federal superiors arrived at the station before noon. They reviewed the Dashcam footage themselves. What they saw made them furious. Robert Washington, the special agent in charge of the FBI field office, watched the footage in silence. When it ended, he simply said, "That officer attempted to murder a federal agent." No one disagreed with him. Washington immediately contacted the United States Attorney's Office. By midday, federal prosecutors were reviewing the case. By evening, the decision had been made. This would be a federal civil rights case. Derek would be charged with deprivation of rights under color of law, and with brandishing a firearm in the commission of a crime of violence. But the public did not know this yet. What the public knew came from Gable's carefully orchestrated media campaign. Gable appeared on local news that afternoon, defending Derek. He spoke about the challenges young officers faced. He talked about the burden of snap decisions that officers had to make every day. He emphasized that Derek had been attempting to do his job, and now he was being attacked by a federal government that was overreaching its authority. The local Oak Ridge community, which knew nothing about federal law or civil rights violations, or the actual footage from the Dashcam, listened to Gable's narrative. A young officer, just 6 weeks off probation, a difficult situation, a federal agent who claimed status. It all seemed plausible. It all seemed possible. And Derek, interviewed carefully by Gable, appeared sympathetic. He appeared to be a young man who had made a mistake and was being attacked for it. The local newspaper ran a headline, "Oak Ridge officer under fire for traffic stop." The article quoted Gable extensively. The article mentioned the federal credentials, but framed them as the source of confusion rather than the source of truth. David watched this unfold from his home, where he had been told to remain while the federal investigation proceeded. His wife Jennifer sat beside him on the couch as they watched Derek's attorney defend the indefensible on local television. "Can he do this?" Jennifer asked. "Can he just lie?" "Yes," David said quietly. "Until the truth is made public, lies are all anyone knows." The federal prosecutors were moving fast. They had subpoenaed the Dashcam footage immediately. They had obtained Derek's personnel file and found what they expected. A pattern. 7 prior complaints in Derek's 6 years on the force. 3 of them involved minority citizens. All had been dismissed through union intervention. All had involved Derek's escalation or aggression. Derek had been flagged by his training officers as a liability, but he had been retained because the department needed bodies. The federal investigation revealed something even darker. Derek's supervisor had known about the complaints. Derek's training instructor had recommended he not be released from probation early. But Derek had been released anyway, pushed through the system to fill staffing shortages. By the 4th day after the traffic stop, the narrative had solidified in the public consciousness. A young officer was being persecuted by federal overreach. A federal agent had claimed authority that he might not actually have. There was confusion. There was a misunderstanding. And Derek Hayes was being made into a scapegoat for a situation that was more complicated than it appeared. But the federal prosecutors knew something that the local community did not. They had video evidence that proved Derek was lying. They had video evidence that proved David was telling the truth. They had video evidence that could not be argued with, could not be spun, could not be reinterpreted through the lens of police procedure or officer safety. The video was the truth, but the video had not yet been released. On day 5, the federal prosecutors made a decision that would change everything. U.S. Attorney Catherine Mills authorized the release of the unredacted Dashcam footage to every major news network in the country simultaneously. This was unusual. This was aggressive. This was the federal government deciding that controlling the narrative was important enough to bypass standard discovery procedures. The decision came from the top. The Attorney General had been briefed. The decision had been made at the highest level of the Justice Department. The footage would be released, and it would be released all at once, making it impossible for any single network to control the story or for Gable to spin it away. On Tuesday afternoon at exactly 2 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, the video dropped. Within minutes, it was being broadcast on every news network. Within an hour, it was the #1 trending topic globally. Millions of viewers sat glued to their screens watching the high-definition video of the encounter. They heard David Sterling's calm, impeccably professional voice, clearly declaring his weapon and his federal status. They saw Derek approaching the car with aggression. They witnessed Derek's escalation. They saw Derek draw his weapon. They heard Derek's mocking laugh. "Yeah, right. A federal agent and I am the president." They saw David's perfect compliance. They heard David's clear, calm instructions. They watched as Derek's panic escalated despite David's absolute non-resistance. And they saw the moment when Derek pointed his loaded weapon at the back of a restrained federal agent, who was standing completely still. The video was undeniable. The audio was crystal clear. The truth was inescapable. By 4 p.m., civil rights organizations were issuing statements. By 5 p.m., national police unions were distancing themselves from Derek. By 6 p.m., even the local commentators who had defended Derek the day before were retracting their positions on air. The narrative that Gable had so carefully constructed collapsed in real time, incinerated by undeniable truth. When Derek's attorney tried to call Gable's office that afternoon, the receptionist abruptly hung up on him. Gable was already moving on to his next client, already preparing his defense for the next situation. Gable had lost this round, and he understood that staying attached to Derek would only damage his other cases. Derek sat in his apartment watching the same video footage being played on every channel. He watched strangers comment on his actions. He watched his life come apart in real time, broadcast to millions of people around the world. He finally understood in a way that his training had never prepared him for, that his badge did not protect him, that his authority did not shield him, that the camera had seen everything, and the camera did not lie. The grand jury was convened by Wednesday. The evidence presented was overwhelming. The Dashcam footage, testimony from backup officers about what they had witnessed, Derek's own statement to his supervisor, carefully documented, evidence of Derek's prior complaints, evidence of the department's knowledge of Derek's pattern of escalation. By Thursday morning, Derek Hayes had been formally indicted on 2 federal charges: deprivation of rights under color of law in violation of 18 U.S.C. Section 242, and brandishing a firearm during a crime of violence. The charges carried a potential sentence of up to 15 years in federal prison. The weapon enhancement alone suggested a minimum of 8 to 10 years. The arrest warrant was executed at 6 a.m. on Friday morning. Federal agents arrived at Derek's apartment with an arrest warrant. The timing was deliberate. The news cameras had been called. Gable, in a decision that would haunt him, had invited local news to Derek's neighborhood the day before, believing that media presence would protect his client. Instead, the media presence ensured that Derek's arrest would be captured for broadcast. His perp walk, his humiliation, would be captured for broadcast. Derek was led out of his apartment building in handcuffs, dressed in a gray t-shirt and sweatpants, his face visible to every camera, his name being broadcast across every screen. His co-workers would see this. His family would see this. His community would see this. The same community that had defended him 4 days earlier would now watch him being led away by federal agents. Derek faced federal charges. Derek faced federal prosecutors. Derek faced a federal courtroom. Derek no longer had the protection of his local police union or his local community. Derek was now facing the full machinery of federal justice, and the machinery was moving with the force and inevitability of an avalanche. The federal prosecution was assigned to Michael Torres, a prosecutor known for his meticulous preparation and his ability to dismantle bad faith police defenses. Torres spent weeks building his case, but the truth was that the case was already built. The Dashcam had done that for him. Torres obtained Derek's complete personnel file, 7 prior complaints, 3 involving minority citizens, all mysteriously dismissed. Torres obtained the training evaluations that had flagged Derek as a liability. Torres obtained the documentation showing that Derek had been pushed through probation early despite recommendations to the contrary. Torres obtained Derek's own statements, his own words, his own admissions. Torres's strategy was simple. This was not the story of a single bad officer. This was the story of a system that protected bad officers, enabled bad officers, and celebrated bad officers as long as they wore a badge. Derek's defense attorney, a federally appointed public defender named James Wilson, worked with the limited tools he had available. Wilson argued that Derek had followed proper procedure based on the information he had at the time. Wilson argued that Derek had exercised reasonable caution. Wilson argued that Derek's hand had trembled because the situation was tense, not because Derek was panicked or unstable. But every argument he made was contradicted by the video. The video showed Derek escalating without cause. The video showed Derek mocking David. The video showed Derek drawing his weapon not because of a reasonable threat, but because Derek was panicked by David's calm authority. Torres called witnesses who established David's credentials and character. David's supervisors testified that David was one of the finest agents they had ever worked with. David's colleagues testified that David's response to Derek's commands had been textbook federal protocol. David's 22 years of service, his exemplary record, his expertise in high-threat situations, all of it was established in the courtroom. Then Torres called Derek's own colleagues to the stand. Derek's training officer testified that he had specifically recommended Derek not be released early from probation because of concerns about Derek's escalation patterns and judgment. Derek's sergeant testified that Derek's prior reports had been suspicious, that patterns had been noted, that Derek had never faced consequences because the union had intervened. The shift in the courtroom was palpable. The police department was not protecting Derek anymore. The police department was protecting itself, and that meant distancing itself from Derek as quickly as possible. When David took the stand, the courtroom fell silent. He was dressed in an impeccably tailored dark charcoal suit, his gold FBI credentials pinned to his lapel. He spoke with the kind of calm authority that comes from 2 decades of federal service. He recounted the night of the traffic stop with cold, precise, undeniable facts. He did not show anger. He did not show vindictiveness. He showed something far more devastating: professional disappointment. He showed the look of a man who understood that the system he had served for 22 years had failed him in the most basic way. When Torres asked David what he was thinking when the gun was pointed at his back, David replied with the kind of precision that only a federal agent could manage. "I was calculating the probability of a fatal negligent discharge considering the visible uncontrolled tremors in Officer Hayes's hands." The courtroom understood what that meant. David in that moment had believed he might die, not because David was panicked, but because David understood the danger of an unstable officer with a loaded weapon. Torres played the Dashcam video one final time. On the massive courtroom monitors, the silence in the room was absolute. There was no sound except the audio from the video. Derek's voice, David's voice, the sounds of struggle and fear. Derek sat slumped at the defense table, his face buried deep in his hands, his shoulders shaking as he wept silently. He finally understood the gravity of his hubris. The badge he thought made him untouchable was simply a cheap piece of metal. The authority he thought was unlimited was about to be stripped away. The future he thought was guaranteed was collapsing before his eyes. The federal jury deliberated for less than 2 hours. They returned with a unanimous verdict. Guilty on both counts. The courtroom seemed to hold its breath as the verdict was read. Derek's attorney accepted the verdict on his client's behalf. The judge ordered a pre-sentence investigation. The sentencing hearing was scheduled for 2 weeks away. Derek was remanded into federal custody immediately. He was transported to a federal holding facility to await sentencing. He sat alone in a cell, for the first time truly understanding that his life had been transformed by the choices he had made in a single 12-minute encounter on a quiet suburban street. When the sentencing hearing arrived, the federal judge, a woman named Patricia Hennessy, who had been on the bench for 16 years, delivered her sentence with zero leniency. "Officer Hayes, you wore a uniform that was supposed to represent public trust, but you acted as a tyrant driven by prejudice and an unearned ego. You nearly cost a distinguished federal officer his life. You violated the constitutional rights of a citizen. You abused the authority that was given to you." The judge sentenced Derek Hayes to 9 years in federal prison, to be followed by 5 years of heavily supervised release. Derek was permanently stripped of his right to own a firearm. Derek was permanently banned from ever holding any position in law enforcement, security, or public trust for the rest of his natural life. Derek's life as he had known it was over, because Derek was a former police officer whose face had been plastered across national television. He could not be placed in the general prison population. General population meant danger. It meant other inmates knowing that Derek had been a cop, had violated another man's rights, had abused his authority. It meant Derek would not survive. Instead, Derek was transferred to a high-security federal facility and locked away in a segregated protective custody wing. He would spend 23 hours a day in a cramped cinder-block cell. Entirely isolated from the world he once thought he ruled, he was left only with the echoing memory of a siren and a silently blinking dashcam. The verdict and sentencing triggered an immediate response from Oak Ridge Police Department command staff. They understood what was coming. Federal scrutiny, federal investigation, the examination of their institutional failures. Within 48 hours, the FBI's Civil Rights Division opened a comprehensive investigation into the Oak Ridge Police Department's handling of prior complaints against Derek Hayes. The investigation revealed what Robert Washington's team had suspected, a pattern of dismissing complaints, of allowing the union to obstruct investigations, of protecting officers from consequences. The investigation revealed that between 2015 and 2023, minority citizens had filed 7 complaints against Derek Hayes. All 7 complaints had been classified as unsubstantiated. All 7 complaints had been dismissed without serious investigation. The pattern was unmistakable. Further investigation revealed that Derek's training officer had documented concerns about Derek's escalation tendencies. But Derek's supervisor had overruled the recommendation because the department needed to fill staffing shortages. The department had chosen expediency over caution, and now they were facing federal scrutiny for that choice. The review board established by the Attorney General recommended comprehensive reforms. Mandatory de-escalation training for all officers. Body camera activation mandatory for all traffic stops, with footage to be reviewed within 72 hours. Automatic supervisory approval required for all traffic stops after 10 p.m. Establishment of a civilian review board with subpoena power and authority to investigate complaints. Oak Ridge Police Chief James Peterson announced the reforms in a press conference. He spoke about accountability. He spoke about commitment to change. He spoke about doing better. What he did not speak about was the institutional failure that had allowed Derek Hayes to operate unchecked for 6 years. Derek's training officer, the man who had been right all along, announced his retirement. He took responsibility for not fighting harder against Derek's release, even though his objection had been overruled by supervisors. The captain who had approved Derek's early probation completion resigned quietly. Federal review suggested he had known that staffing shortage was not a legitimate reason to override the training officer's concerns. But he had prioritized administrative convenience over officer vetting. The police union began distancing itself from Derek. The union understood that Derek had become a liability, that defending him would damage the union's credibility in other cases, that it was better to acknowledge Derek's misconduct than to protect him. David Sterling returned to work the week after Derek's sentencing. The FBI director himself attended a ceremony to commend David for his extraordinary restraint, discipline, and professionalism under mortal peril. The director acknowledged publicly that David's calm response likely saved Derek's life. If David had resisted, if David had made any sudden movement, if David had challenged Derek's authority physically rather than verbally, Derek might have fired. David received an assignment back to the Violent Crime Task Force. He returned to work he was designed to do. Work that mattered. Work that had meaning beyond the violation he had suffered. But David also understood something that he had not fully grasped before. The badge did not protect him. The federal credentials did not shield him. The 22 years of service did not make him invisible to racism or to the trauma of wrongful arrest. David began working with the federal prosecutors who had prosecuted Derek's case. He began consulting on de-escalation training. He testified at federal training academies about civil rights violations. He became an unlikely expert in police accountability, using his own experience as a teaching tool. In the months following Derek's conviction, David testified in 3 other federal civil rights cases involving similar violations. In each case, the prosecutors cited Derek's conviction, the video evidence, the established precedent that badge did not equal immunity. David's colleagues supported him. His supervisors supported him. His family supported him. The institutional machinery of the FBI moved behind him, protecting him, affirming him, validating his actions and his character. David reflected on that traffic stop, on those moments when Derek's weapon had been pointed at his back, on the calculation he had made about the probability of death. He understood that his 22 years of training had allowed him to survive. His discipline had allowed him to remain calm. His expertise had allowed him to communicate in a way that did not escalate the situation further. But David also understood something darker. Another man in his position, another black man, another person without his federal credentials and his authority and his institutional support, might not have survived that traffic stop. Across the country, police departments began reviewing their own procedures. The Oak Ridge case had become a template, a precedent, a teachable moment. Federal prosecutors used Derek's conviction to justify civil rights prosecutions in 3 other departments. All 3 resulted in convictions. All 3 resulted in prison sentences. Insurance companies covering police departments began requiring body cameras as a condition of coverage. The financial incentive was clear. Departments with body cameras had better outcomes in civil rights cases. Departments without body cameras were facing higher premiums. Derek's case became required curriculum at the FBI Academy. Trainees studied the Dashcam footage. They learned about Derek's escalation. They learned about the consequences. They learned that the badge did not provide immunity, that the video provided truth, that bad decisions in 12 minutes could destroy careers and change lives. The Oak Ridge Police Department's reforms began showing results within 6 months. Traffic stops decreased by 40%. Stops of minority citizens decreased by 42%. Complaints about officer behavior decreased by 63%. The Civilian Review Board, newly formed, received 23 prior complaints from citizens. Many of these complaints had been filed years ago and withdrawn because the complainants had given up hope of being heard. Now, with a mechanism in place, these complaints were being heard. The Review Board recommended investigation into 2 other officers with patterns similar to Derek's. 1 officer retired. 1 officer was placed on retraining with federal oversight. The pattern was being interrupted. The system was beginning to change. Derek, year 2 of his 9-year sentence, age 26, now sat alone in his protective custody cell. The isolation was profound. 23 hours in a 6x8 cell. 1 hour of exercise in a locked yard where he never saw another human being. His marriage had ended. His wife had filed for divorce during the trial. She could not handle the public humiliation. She could not handle being married to the face of police brutality. She could not handle a future married to a man who would spend the next 7 years in prison. His mother had stopped visiting after the first year. She could not bear the shame in their community. She could not face the other parishioners at her church. She could not live with a son who had become nationally infamous for his racism and his brutality. His former colleagues avoided him. The brotherhood of the badge that Derek had believed in so deeply, that had motivated him to become a police officer in the first place, had abandoned him utterly. He was no longer one of them. He was a liability. He was an embarrassment. He was the example they used to tell recruits. This is what happens when you abuse your authority. Derek had no parole eligibility for 8 more years. Even then, parole was not guaranteed. He would have to demonstrate remorse, rehabilitation, change. But Derek was still insisting in his conversations with the prison psychologist that he had been right, that the situation had been more complex than the video showed, that he had followed procedure. Derek, at age 32, would be released possibly into a world where he could not own a firearm, could not work in law enforcement, could not work in security, could not work in any position of authority. His options would be limited. His future would be constrained. His life would be marked permanently by those 12 minutes on a suburban street. Meanwhile, David Sterling continued his federal work. At 63, he was being considered for a supervisory role that would take him from the field into leadership. His career was continuing upward. His authority was being affirmed and expanded. His life was moving in the direction he had envisioned. Their trajectories, which had crossed for 12 minutes on a Tuesday evening, had diverged permanently. One man's life was expanding. The other man's life was contracting. The difference was not luck. The difference was choice. David's choice to remain calm. Derek's choice to escalate. The camera had recorded both choices, and the consequences flowed from them like water flowing downhill. 5 years later, the Dashcam footage from Derek Hayes' traffic stop had been downloaded more than 40 million times. It was taught in police academies across the country. It was used in civil rights training programs. It was referenced in federal courtrooms as the gold standard of documented police misconduct. The Oak Ridge Police Department's reforms had become the Oak Ridge Protocol. adopted by 47 police departments across the country. Other departments had implemented mandatory de-escalation training because of this case. Other departments had installed body cameras because of this case. Other departments had established civilian review boards because of this case. Derek Hayes had become a cautionary tale. His name appeared in training materials. His actions were discussed in seminars. His conviction was cited in legal briefs. His failure had become a tool for preventing other failures. Oak Ridge itself had changed. The quiet suburb that prided itself on safety now prided itself on accountability. The community that had been shocked to learn about Derek's prior complaints, about the dismissals, about the institutional protection, had demanded change, and the change had happened. David Sterling received the FBI's Director's Award for Excellence in Civil Rights Advocacy. The award recognized his work in training other agents, in helping to develop de-escalation protocols, in using his own experience to prevent other officers from making Derek's mistakes. David gave a speech at the award ceremony. He spoke about the importance of remaining calm under pressure. He spoke about the power of institutional support. He spoke about the luck of having video evidence. He acknowledged the other officers who had supported him, the prosecutors who had fought for justice, the system that had ultimately held Derek accountable. "I was fortunate," David said simply. "I was fortunate to have a federal badge that meant something. I was fortunate to have supervisors who protected me. I was fortunate to have video evidence. Not everyone in my position would have had those resources. Not everyone would have survived what I survived." 10 years after the traffic stop, the Oak Ridge Police Academy had completely redesigned its training curriculum. The case of Derek Hayes and David Sterling was not just a footnote in the training. It was central to how new officers were taught to understand authority, to understand the power of the badge, to understand the consequences of escalation. Young officers graduating from the academy in 2033, 2034, and beyond would have studied Derek's case before they ever put on a uniform. They would have watched the Dashcam footage. They would have learned about Derek's prior complaints, about the institutional protection, about the federal investigation, about the conviction. They would understand in ways that Derek never could that the badge was not a weapon. That authority was a responsibility, not a right. That the camera was always watching. That consequences were real. The civil rights movement had found a new weapon in Derek's case. Video evidence that proved what activists had long documented. The Dashcam footage validated years of testimony from black citizens who had reported abuse, who had said they were treated unfairly, who had been dismissed as complaining or exaggerating. Now federal prosecutors could point to the footage and say, "Look, this is what it looks like. This is what racism in policing looks like. This is what abuse of authority looks like." Derek's case had become a reference point in legal education. Law schools taught it as a case study in federal civil rights law. Constitutional law professors used it to illustrate Fourth Amendment violations. Criminal procedure courses used it as an example of improper search and seizure. One traffic stop, 12 minutes of video. A decision to release the evidence to the public. These had changed how an entire nation understood police accountability. In year 8 of his sentence, Derek Hayes became eligible for parole. His case file was substantial. His disciplinary record in prison was clean. No infractions, no violence, no incidents. Just 8 years of isolation and silence. At his parole hearing, Derek was asked if he understood what he had done wrong. Derek's response was carefully crafted. He acknowledged that his actions had been improper. He acknowledged that he had violated the rights of a federal agent. He acknowledged that the video evidence was clear. But he stopped short of genuine remorse. He still believed deep down that the situation had been more complex than it appeared. That David should have cooperated more completely. That the federal response had been overreaching. That he had been made a scapegoat for a situation that was more nuanced than the public understood. The parole board listened to Derek's testimony. They reviewed his prison record. They reviewed the federal court records. They reviewed the victim impact statement, which David Sterling had been invited to provide but had declined to provide, feeling that Derek's prison time was sufficient punishment for the crime that had already been prosecuted. The parole board recommended continuation of Derek's sentence. Derek would not be released. Derek would serve the full 9 years. Derek would face re-evaluation for parole only after serving at least 2 additional years. Derek returned to his protective custody cell, to his 23-hour-per-day isolation, to his continued punishment. His future remained completely constrained. Even if he was released, even if he eventually won parole, his options would be limited. His record would follow him. His name would be connected to this case forever. David Sterling, at age 71, was contemplating retirement from the FBI. His career had been long and distinguished. His work in civil rights had been recognized and respected. His impact on police training and accountability had been profound. David spent his final months in the FBI mentoring younger agents, teaching them the lessons he had learned, not just from the Derek Hayes case, but from 29 years of federal service. He taught them about de-escalation. He taught them about recognizing bias. He taught them about the importance of remaining calm under pressure. When David retired, his colleagues threw him a celebration. They spoke about his career. They spoke about his impact. They spoke about the difference he had made. David, in his remarks, was reflective. He spoke about luck. He spoke about the importance of institutional support. He spoke about the power of remaining true to one's training and values even when under threat. "I survived that traffic stop because I was trained to survive it," David said. Officer Hayes escalated it because he failed to remember what he was trained to do. The difference between our lives is not fate. It is choice. It is what we choose to do when we have power, when we have authority, when we have the opportunity to do harm or to do good. I made the choice to remain calm. Officer Hayes made the choice to escalate. The camera saw both choices and justice followed from them. The dashcam footage of that traffic stop is still taught in law enforcement academies. It is still cited in federal courtrooms. It is still used to train officers about the dangers of bias, the costs of escalation, the permanence of consequences. Derek Hayes remains in federal prison, now age 32, now in year 9 of his sentence, now facing the reality that his parole request has been denied and that he will serve additional time before he faces another evaluation. Whatever future Derek might have, whatever limited, constrained, supervised future he might eventually be allowed to live, it will be forever marked by those 12 minutes on a quiet suburban street, by his choices, by his actions, by the camera that saw everything. David Sterling, in retirement, continues to consult with federal prosecutors, continues to train officers, continues to use his experience to prevent other officers from making Derek's mistakes. The Oak Ridge Police Department continues to operate under the reforms that were demanded. The Civilian Review Board continues to hear complaints. The body cameras continue to record. The training continues to teach officers that authority is not power over others, but responsibility to serve all people equally fairly and with the respect they deserve. 1 moment, 12 minutes, a silently blinking camera. These changed everything. The truth was recorded. The truth was released. The truth prevailed. And in prevailing, it sent a message to every officer, in every jurisdiction, in every patrol car in this country. The camera is always watching. Authority is always being judged. Consequences are always real. Your choices matter. And those choices are recorded forever. The story of Derek Hayes and David Sterling became more than a single incident of injustice and accountability. It became a reflection of larger truths about power bias and the possibility of change. In the years following the conviction, other police departments that had similar patterns began facing federal scrutiny. Officers with multiple complaints, union protection, dismissals. Federal prosecutors, emboldened by the success in Derek's case, pursued civil rights violations with greater aggressiveness. The precedent had been set. The video evidence had provided undeniable proof. Other convictions followed. Body camera footage became the new standard of truth. Where there had been disagreement about what happened in police encounters, the camera became the arbiter. Departments that had resisted body cameras found themselves on the wrong side of federal investigation. Departments that implemented comprehensive body camera programs found their complaints and use of force incidents decreasing. The culture of law enforcement began to shift slowly and imperfectly, but genuinely. Not all departments changed. Not all officers understood the lesson. But enough change occurred that the message was clear. The days of institutional protection for officers who abused their authority were ending. David Sterling's testimony in 3 additional federal civil rights cases resulted in 3 additional convictions. 3 additional officers went to prison. 3 additional departments faced federal scrutiny and forced reform. The Oak Ridge Protocol spread across the country. 47 departments adopted it by year 5. By year 10, more than 200 departments had implemented some version of Oak Ridge's mandatory de-escalation training, body camera requirements, and Civilian Review Board structure. Was the system perfect? Number. Was racism in policing solved? No. Was institutional bias eliminated? No. But the system was better, because one man remained calm under threat, because one officer was held accountable, because a camera recorded the truth, because federal prosecutors believed the evidence, because citizens demanded change, and because a quiet suburban street became the stage where justice eventually prevailed. Subscribe our channel